Hello everyone, and welcome to our first season concert of the LSO 2020-2021. Of course, we had hoped to all be together live on stage at Viterbo, but under the intrepid leadership of Eva Marie Restel and our equally magnificent board of directors, the La Crosse Symphony Orchestra is one of a relative handful of American orchestras that is forging ahead with live performances, live to, of course, a very limited audience in person at Viterbo, and to so many more of you via the modern miracle of live stream. Tonight we present to you a concert that would be a beautiful program of the La Crosse Symphony by any standard, with three of the very greatest composers in our classical music tradition, spanning 3 centuries of repertoire. We'll begin with a beautiful little gem of a work for string orchestra, the Andante Festivo by Jean Sibelius, whose entire cycle of symphonies we've been going through, of course, over the years at the LSO. Then we will have one of the glories of the Baroque, the Violin Concerto in E major of Johann Sebastian Bach, and to finish, one of the immortal works of the string orchestra repertoire, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky's Serenade for Strings. When it comes to the Bach Concerto, we had planned on presenting to our LSO audience in her debut the prodigiously talented young African-American violinist, Ty Murray. Of course, for reasons that can be easily understood, Ty Murray chose to cancel her appearance with us this week, as she would have had to fly to La Crosse all the way from Boston. We will look forward to bringing her at last to the LSO in another concerto performance in the very near future. In the interim, I am so proud to say that our equally gifted longtime concertmaster of the LSO, Mr. Wes Luke, will, in addition to serving as the orchestra's concertmaster this evening, serve as the soloist for the Bach Concerto. Now, as some of you may know, Johann Sebastian Bach was a composer whose name comes down to us mainly due to the creation of a monumental ocean, if you will, of sacred works in the Lutheran tradition of the 18th century. Well over 200 sacred and some secular, but mostly sacred cantatas, the St. Matthew and St. John Passion settings, and of course, the B minor Mass. This is largely because this was the music that was required of Bach, working for a series of princes and dukes, and most famously working for the bishop of the legendary Church of St. Thomas in Leipzig in Germany, which to this day is renowned for its musical program and for its choir, which some of you may remember actually toured the Cooley region just a couple of years ago. J.S. Bach was a man of fervent belief and took great pleasure and privilege in writing all those reams of brilliant sacred music for voices and orchestra. But he also delighted in the creation of secular works, and as was the reality then, this was due to the predilections of his princely employers. Bach, of course, ended his career as the cantor of St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, but for several years before, generally speaking, if I remember correctly, from the years 1717 to 1723, he composed music as the chief court musician for a German prince who was of resolutely Calvinist persuasions. This was a prince, a duke, who was not a Lutheran or a Roman Catholic, but instead a Calvinist. He was the Prince Leopold of the tiny North German Principality of Anhalt-Köthen. Of course, this is the years in the 18th and most of the 19th centuries when Germany was a loose confederation of princely states. So Prince Leopold was a Calvinist, what we would now call a Presbyterian. And while Presbyterians today absolutely enjoy singing and listening to music in their churches, in those early days of Calvinism, in the early 18th century, Prince Leopold, like many a Calvinist of his time, was not at all interested in music for the church. So instead, he commissioned from Bach a veritable flow of secular works, concertos, orchestral suites, suites for solo instruments, sonatas and partitas for solo instruments. It's from the Köthen years that Bach's immortal suites for solo cello, his sonatas and partitas for solo violin come from. Also, lest we forget, the truly immortal set of Brandenburg concertos. Bach also left us, he probably actually composed several more works that just didn't survive. He left us 3 violin concertos, a concerto for 2 violins in D minor, a concerto for solo violin in A minor, and then the work we're going to share in this evening, the concerto in E major, the most glorious of all his violin concertos. This is a work in which Bach, we think of Bach as this very severe North German Lutheran artist and musician. He was also truly a man of the world, a man of cosmopolitan musical interests. His favorite composer at that time was no less than Antonio Vivaldi, the great composer of Venice, who left us, of course, among other hundreds of concertos, the Four Seasons. Bach was a huge admirer of Vivaldi. He actually transcribed several Vivaldi concertos into works for the organ. But it is in the spirit, not the imitation, but in the spirit of Vivaldi that Bach wrote his 3, the ones that we know, the 3 violin concertos. Nowhere is this lineage to the great composers of Italy in the Baroque more apparent than in this E major concerto. It is in the concerto style of the Venetian school of the early 18th century. The work, the opening movement of the work is in what we call a ritornello form, which is an Italian term signifying that there's a basic idea that comes back again and again and again, in which the soloist is in dialogue with the little orchestral ensemble and presents contrasting material. The slow movement, it's a 3-movement work, fast, slow, fast. The central slow movement is built again in this Venetian Baroque tradition entirely on a ground bass, this haunting idea in the relative minor key of C sharp minor. It's a concerto in E major, so the relative minor is key area is C sharp. It's this haunting, tragic, very profound idea that you hear in the cellos and the bass, and it just gets repeated again and again, and over which the upper strings and the violin soloists spin their unending improvisations. The finale, the vigorous, joyful finale, is in what we would today call a kind of a rondo form, where again, one idea comes back several times, and in between you have episodes of contrasting thematic material. It's safe to say that J.S. Bach takes that Venetian concerto and style that he happily inherited from Vivaldi and gives that style, shall we say, a monumentality that would befit the magnificence of that St. Thomas Church that was yet to be in J.S. Bach's future. The way that a great composer not borrows, not imitates, but builds on the traditions of those artists around him or her and before them. It's a perfect crystalline example of the Baroque concerto style. Well, it was actually in harking back to the spirit of the great composers of the 18th century, that Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, that ultimate composer of Russian, heart-on-sleeve Russian late Romanticism, wrote his Serenade for strings. The work was composed in the years 1880, 1881, and this work, like many other fascinating masterpieces by Tchaikovsky, comes from this interlude, this almost 10-year-long, this decade-long interlude in Tchaikovsky's career as a composer. It was in 1877, if memory serves me correctly, that Tchaikovsky wrote his cathartic Symphony No. 4, which had been really the musical, the creative response to a profound crisis in his personal romantic life. After composing that catharsis of the Symphony No. 4, Tchaikovsky really took like almost a decade-long vacation from composing symphonies. Rather, he focused on works that would bring together his desire to be a composer of symphonies in that Central European Germanic tradition with his equally strong desire to be a composer in the Russian style, to celebrate his not quite European identity as a proud Russian artist. But threefold, it was also to indulge his lifelong love and adoration of the world of French music, most specifically that of ballet. Ballet being, of course, at its core, a French and it must be said, a very aristocratically French art form. Brought, as in so much of Russian imperial culture, brought, I should say, from France, the inherently elegant art form of ballet appealed so greatly to the world of late imperial Russia in the late 19th century. Tchaikovsky, of course, was almost at his happiest when composing ballets: Swan Lake, The Nutcracker, and The Sleeping Beauty. And in this 10-year interregnum, so as it were, between writing his Symphony No. 4 and his very Germanic, Austro-German feeling Symphony No. 5, Tchaikovsky again wanted to write works which brought together the three strands of his very complicated musical personality, and that light and elegant world of the French ballet was never far away. During this 10-year working vacation, Tchaikovsky wrote his cycle of fascinating 4 orchestral suites, not symphonies, mind you, but he labeled them orchestral suites, where the world of the symphony and the ballet suite were brought together. They are gorgeous works, and I hope someday to be able to conduct them for you in La Crosse. But there was a particular year in 1880, 1881, where he, like many a great composer, worked on 2 very different works simultaneously. One of those works was a work, upon finishing it, he immediately dismissed as an annoying trifle in his many famous letters to his friends. That work became known as a little piece called the 1812 Overture. You know, that piece that orchestras all over the world, well, all over America, certainly perform on or around the 4th of July. He dismissed this as just a diversion. But in the same letters that he would write to his friends at that time, he also said that he had also completed a work that he immediately thought was his greatest and most favorite work. And that work was really a symphony for string orchestra in all but name, Tchaikovsky's Serenade for Strings. As I said earlier, this is a work that, and again, he describes this in his letters, a work that consciously hearkened back to the world of the serenade, which for him most of all meant the world of Mozart. And as with those many Mozart serenades, of course, serenade deriving from an Italian word, music for the evening, evenings entertainment music, a music inherently lighter in scope, in emotional depth maybe, but not really, but that's another subject. But he wanted to consciously emulate the world of his beloved Mozart and his gorgeous dinner party entertainment style of serenades. Well, Tchaikovsky, being a late Romantic Russian symphonic genius, it could never, when he said he wanted to write lighter music, of course, it is lighter relative to his weightier symphonies, but make no mistake, the Serenade for Strings, in its own very elegant way, is a work as profound in its expression, as immortal in its musical ideas and content than any of his weightiest large-scale works. It is a work in 4 movements, like a symphony. It takes a bow to the world of the serenade in that the second movement, well, of course, for Mozart, this would have been the dance music movement. For Mozart, it would have been a minuet. For Tchaikovsky, it is another one of his adopted Western European forms. Probably his favorite form in which to write. It is a lilting Viennese waltz seen through Tchaikovsky's Russian lens. The first movement, he gives it the title. It's my favorite title in the world in Italian, and I love trying to pronounce it in my bad Italian. He labels the first movement "Pezzo in forma di sonatina," a piece in the form of a sonatina. In other words, a little sonata. This harks back not only to the world of Mozart, but more specifically to the world of all those bel canto Italian opera composers of the early 19th century that Tchaikovsky equally adored. And those composers like Rossini, Donizetti, Bellini, they would write their overtures in what was called sonatina form. In other words, a sonata form without the central development section. Well, suffice it to say that while there's no formal development section in this Tchaikovsky first movement in the Serenade, Tchaikovsky fully develops his musical ideas as only he could. He couldn't help himself from doing so. So it really is a symphonic first movement. There's this opening chorale idea, this glorious, gleaming C major chorale idea that opens the work, which is unforgettable. And it's good that it's unforgettable because Tchaikovsky brings it back with equal relish at the very end of the first movement and then at some time later. As I said, the second movement, the dance music movement, is the lilting Viennese waltz, but not without great complications of phrasing and harmony, incredible subtlety everywhere. The third movement is where Tchaikovsky very much, notwithstanding his love of Mozart, stays very much on Russian soil. This is one of those immortal Tchaikovsky slow movements, this heartfelt lament that I think only a Russian composer could give us. Again, not without cosmopolitan leanings, because the main melody that you will hear spoken, as it were, sung, as it were, in the first violins, also owes its derivations to the world of Italian, early 19th century Italian bel canto opera. Our first violin section becomes like a prima donna soprano, but then that material is developed in a uniquely Russian style. Well, it's overtly in the Russian style that Tchaikovsky launches us into the finale without interruption. He labels the finale tema russo, in Italian, on a Russian theme. And after a poignant, halting, slow introduction, we hear that characteristically Russian folk dance theme. But if you listen very carefully, it is nothing more or less than the opening, grand, almost Brahmsian C major chorale with which Tchaikovsky began his Serenade for Strings, but now the notes, those opening notes, are greatly sped up and in reverse order. And Tchaikovsky makes this plain musically, technically, and dramatically when he brings back that opening C major chorale at the very end of his last movement of the Serenade for Strings, bringing the work to a truly magnificent conclusion. Well, another kind of magnificence is instilled in the little work with which we will begin our concert for you tonight. The Andante Festivo by a composer who excelled in the generation immediately after Tchaikovsky. In many ways, the Tchaikovsky of Finland. That, of course, is Jean Sibelius. Sibelius's very early works, like his Symphony No. 1, pay rather obvious and not at all in a negative way, pay homage to the symphonic tradition of Russian composers like Tchaikovsky, also Alexander Borodin. By the time he writes his second symphony, Sibelius has become one of the truly, completely original artistic voices of the 20th century. In fact, when I think of Sibelius in his total purity of style, his utterly original voice, I can think of only 3 other equally great artists of the 20th century in all forms. Igor Stravinsky, of course, the great Russian composer, the painter Pablo Picasso, and Wisconsin's own Frank Lloyd Wright, without question the greatest architect of the 20th century. It's not surprising that Frank Lloyd Wright frequently said that his favorite composer was Sibelius, because like the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, Sibelius's music seems to be truly organic. It truly seems to come out of the ground, out of the fertile fields and forests, and most especially the thousands of lakes and rivulets of the country of Finland. Sibelius became, by early middle age, a national hero in Finland, kind of a musical George Washington to the nascent Finnish state, which of course, up until World War I, was struggling under the yoke of Tsarist Russia. Finland was the Grand Duchy of Finland, part of the Russian Empire. Tchaikovsky, as a young composer, very much symbolized the aspirations of the Finnish people. And by 1922, he truly was Finland's greatest son. It was in that year that a successful sawmill magnate, we all must remember at this point Lacrosse's own glorious industrial history, not unrelated to the industry of forests, sawmills, and the like. It was a sawmill magnate who asked Sibelius to write a celebratory cantata on the 25th anniversary of his sawmill. That's how important, that's how beloved a public figure Sibelius was by that time. Sibelius demurred, saying he didn't have time at that point to write a full-fledged cantata, but he would write a little work for string quartet that he called Andante Festivo, a festival andante. The work was an instant hit, and it soon became a work that got played very often at weddings and funerals. One of Sibelius's daughters, when she was married in 1921, had the work played by a small string ensemble. Sibelius got to thinking that that little Andante Festivo of his was something special, and maybe he should expand it out to full string orchestra. Well, the opportunity came in 1939, right about the time of the New York World's Fair, when the very admired and rather powerful music critic of the New York Times, Olin Downs, wrote a kind of an op-ed piece hoping that Sibelius would write something for his many millions of American fans. In fact, it was that year that the New York Philharmonic took a survey of the listeners of its weekly Saturday broadcasts, or forgive me, they were on Sunday. Metropolitan Opera was on Saturdays, the Philharmonic was on Sundays. And they took a survey of their listeners asking who was their favorite composer, living or dead. And the clear favorite was not Bach or Beethoven or Brahms, but Sibelius. Sibelius took this gesture of adulation very much to heart. It really touched him. And in a gesture of thanks, on New Year's Day in 1939, to help announce the beginning of the 1939 World's Fair, which was held in New York, Sibelius went into a recording studio in Helsinki, Finland. By this point, Sibelius was now literally the grand old man of Finnish music. And he walked into a recording studio of musicians from the Helsinki Radio Orchestra, and he very succinctly rehearsed and then performed in live stream, a 1939 radio version of Live Stream, conducted a performance of his Andante Festivo as a gift to the people of the United States. Then, as now, Sibelius's Andante Festivo was this little gem of radiance, this little gleam of humanity when the world was being thrown into crisis, just a pillar of light in this dark and anxious time. So may it be now, as we go through this challenge together in La Crosse and all around the world. I hope Sibelius's beautiful little Andante is an inspiration to you all the same.